For decades, Russia has reaped massive profits from selling natural gas across Europe's vast network of pipelines. But as geopolitical winds shifted and Moscow began searching for alternative buyers, a historic deal began taking shape on the other side of the Eurasian continent. In 2021, Russia, China, and Mongolia sat down to discuss what could become one of the most ambitious energy infrastructure projects of our generation. A $13 billion natural gas pipeline stretching over 2,600 kilometers through some of the world's most challenging terrain. The plan seemed straightforward enough. Russian gas fields in Siberia would pump 50 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually through Mongolia and into China's energy-hungry economy. Construction was set to begin this year, with completion targeted for 2028. Yet as we approach the end of 2024, bulldozers remain idle, and negotiation rooms have grown tense with unspoken concerns. What's causing this delay? Why has China suddenly grown reluctant about the pipeline's original route through Mongolia? And what does this tell us about the complex web of energy security, geopolitics, and economic strategy that defines our modern world? If you appreciate in-depth analysis of global economic and political developments, consider subscribing to stay updated on stories that shape our interconnected world. Now let's unpack one of the most consequential energy negotiations currently underway. Russia's energy landscape. Understanding the foundation. To understand why this pipeline matters, we need to first appreciate Russia's unique position in the global energy marketplace. The country sits atop some of the planet's most substantial natural gas reserves, with the Siberian plains alone holding deposits that have fueled Russian exports for generations. Back in 2011, the Siberian region was already producing approximately 40% of Russia's entire domestic natural gas output. That's a staggering concentration of resources in one geographic area. However, there's always been a catch. These gas fields are located far from potential customers, creating significant transportation challenges and driving up costs substantially. For years, Russia focused primarily on European markets, building an extensive pipeline network westward. But relying heavily on one customer base carries inherent risks, as recent geopolitical events have dramatically demonstrated. Moscow needed diversification, and geography offered an obvious answer. China, sitting right across Russia's southern border, with a rapidly industrializing economy and skyrocketing energy demands. The relationship made logical sense. Russia possessed abundant natural gas but needed new markets. China required massive quantities of energy but lacked sufficient domestic reserves. The foundation for a major energy partnership was clearly in place. The first pipeline, Siberia 1, really set the stage for everything that followed. The partnership between Moscow and Beijing on energy infrastructure didn't begin recently. As far back as 2015, both nations signed a memorandum of understanding regarding what became known as the Far East Route, a natural gas pipeline project that would later be called Power of Siberia 1. This initial pipeline began operational deliveries in 2019, marking a significant milestone in Sino-Russian energy cooperation. The system was designed to transport 15 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually from Russian fields directly into China's distribution network. But that was just the starting capacity. By 2027, according to the expansion plans, that volume is expected to increase substantially to 38 billion cubic meters per year. This made Russia one of China's most critical natural gas suppliers almost overnight. The reliability and proximity of Russian gas compared favorably to shipments arriving by tanker from distant suppliers. Pipeline gas is generally cheaper to transport over land than liquefied natural gas arriving by sea, and the direct connection offered supply security advantages. However, as successful as Power of Siberia 1 has been, it was never going to be sufficient for China's long-term needs. China's insatiable energy appetite is, frankly, staggering. Let's examine some numbers that illustrate the scale of China's energy challenge. Since 2021, China's annual natural gas consumption has reached approximately 390 billion cubic meters, a figure that increased by 7.6% compared to the previous year. This isn't surprising when you consider China's continued urbanization, industrial expansion, and efforts to transition away from coal toward cleaner energy sources. Of that massive consumption total, roughly 100 billion cubic meters came from Russian sources, accounting for about 33% of China's total natural gas usage. That's already a significant dependency, but it's projected to grow even further. According to forecasts from China's National Energy Administration, by 2024, the country's natural gas consumption is expected to climb to between 420 and 425 billion cubic meters annually. These aren't modest increases. We're talking about sustained growth in a market that's already among the world's largest. The mathematics here create an obvious problem. Even when Power of Siberia 1 reaches its maximum planned capacity of 38 billion cubic meters per year by 2027, it will still fall far short of meeting China's total import requirements. The gap between supply and demand continues widening. This reality forced planners in both Beijing and Moscow to think bigger. One pipeline wouldn't suffice. China needed multiple sources, multiple routes, and greater volumes. Russia, meanwhile, saw an opportunity to lock in a major customer for decades to come. Enter Power of Siberia 2, a project even more ambitious than its predecessor. Power of Siberia 2 represents what some have called the Trilateral Vision. In 2021, Russia and Mongolia jointly approached China with a proposal for trilateral cooperation on what would be called the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. Unlike the first pipeline, which ran along the Far Eastern route, this new project would take a more westerly path, connecting different Russian gas fields to different Chinese markets. The strategic logic was compelling. By strengthening economic ties among all three nations, the project promised benefits extending beyond mere energy transactions. Russia would gain access to additional Chinese markets, Mongolia would receive substantial transit fees and potentially spark broader economic development, and China would diversify its energy supply routes. Russia's Ministry of Energy announced plans to invest up to $13 billion in the endeavor, a massive commitment reflecting the project's strategic importance. The proposed route would start from Tyumen in Russia, cross roughly 900 kilometers through Mongolian territory, and then extend another 1,600 kilometers through China to reach major population and industrial centers in the country's east. The Russian segment itself would add approximately 100 kilometers to the total. When completed, this 2,600-kilometer engineering marvel would be capable of delivering up to 50 billion cubic meters of natural gas to China annually. Combined with Power of Siberia 1's projected capacity, Russia alone could potentially provide China with nearly 90 billion cubic meters per year, a substantial portion of China's import needs. The original timeline was aggressive, but achievable. Construction was scheduled to commence in 2024, with completion targeted for 2028, allowing commercial operations to begin around 2030. Major construction firms began preparing bids, engineers drafted detailed specifications, and diplomats worked on finalizing agreements. From every angle, Power of Siberia 2 appeared to be a win-win scenario. China would enhance its energy security, Russia would diversify its customer base away from excessive European dependence, and Mongolia would receive substantial economic benefits from transit rights. But as 2024 unfolded, something unexpected happened. Or rather, something didn't happen. Construction crews never mobilized. Ground was never broken. The project remained in a state of diplomatic limbo. In June of this year, British media outlets published reports suggesting that negotiations between China and Russia had reached an impasse. According to these accounts, the two powers were deadlocked over fundamental terms, specifically pricing and volume commitments. The reporting suggested that Russia viewed China's proposed prices as unreasonably low, allegedly close to the heavily subsidized domestic rates Russian consumers pay. Moscow reportedly also took issue with China's relatively modest volume commitments, preferring guarantees for larger quantities that would justify the enormous infrastructure investment. From China's perspective, negotiators sought pricing that reflected current global market conditions and remained flexible about volumes until supply reliability could be demonstrated. These revelations surfaced less than a month after China and Russia had issued a joint statement emphasizing their strong bilateral partnership. The timing struck many observers as suspicious. Western media outlets appeared eager to amplify any signs of friction between Moscow and Beijing, perhaps hoping to drive a wedge between two nations whose cooperation challenges Western geopolitical interests. But dismissing these reports entirely as mere propaganda would be, honestly, overly simplistic. Evidence suggests there are genuine complications in the negotiations, though perhaps not the ones Western media chose to emphasize. The real issue, it turns out, has less to do with pricing disputes and far more to do with geography, specifically the proposed route through Mongolia. Here's where the story gets genuinely interesting. According to information that has emerged from various diplomatic and industry sources, China has expressed serious reservations about allowing the pipeline to traverse 900 kilometers of Mongolian territory. This concern wasn't part of the initial discussions, but has since become a potential deal-breaker. Why would China suddenly develop cold feet about involving Mongolia? To understand this, we need to examine Mongolia's recent diplomatic trajectory. Over the past year, Mongolia has been actively strengthening its relationships with Western nations, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom. Ulaanbaatar has been exploring possibilities for establishing direct flight connections with America, bypassing traditional routes through China or Russia. The Mongolian government has also been seeking to diversify its export markets for rare earth minerals and other valuable resources, reducing dependence on its two giant neighbors. This strategy isn't particularly new. Mongolia has long pursued what it calls a third neighbor policy, a diplomatic framework designed to balance relationships with China and Russia while cultivating partnerships with distant powers like the United States, Japan, and European nations. From Mongolia's perspective, this makes perfect sense. Sandwiched between two massive powers, maintaining complete independence requires external counterweights. However, from China's perspective, this increasingly Western-friendly orientation raises red flags, particularly when critical infrastructure is involved. Imagine investing billions of dollars in a pipeline that crosses 900 kilometers through a country whose foreign policy orientation might shift against your interests. This is the calculation troubling Chinese planners. Energy infrastructure represents one of the most strategic assets any nation possesses. Pipelines carrying oil and natural gas are potential pressure points, places where flow can be interrupted, reduced, or used as leverage in diplomatic disputes. History provides numerous examples of nations weaponizing energy supplies for political purposes. For China, the concern is straightforward. If Mongolia's relationship with Western powers continues deepening, could the pipeline become a vulnerability? In a future scenario where geopolitical tensions escalate, might Mongolia come under pressure to restrict or halt flows? Could the pipeline itself become a target for sabotage or a bargaining chip in negotiations China isn't party to? These aren't paranoid fantasies. They're the kind of scenario planning that any responsible government conducts when making multi-decade infrastructure commitments worth billions of dollars. There's also a significant financial dimension to consider. Under international trade practices, when a pipeline crosses through a nation's territory, that country typically charges transit fees. Economic analysts have calculated that Mongolia could potentially earn approximately $30 million annually in foreign exchange income from Power of Siberia 2 once it becomes operational. $30 million might not sound enormous in the context of a $13 billion project, but it represents an ongoing cost that compounds over decades. Moreover, in scenarios where diplomatic relations sour, Mongolia could theoretically increase those fees substantially, using the pipeline as leverage in negotiations. For China, this creates ongoing uncertainty about the true cost of imported gas. Perhaps most concerning from Beijing's perspective is the possibility that critical energy supplies could be interrupted during a moment of strategic vulnerability. To fully appreciate why China takes energy security so seriously, we need to zoom out and look at the bigger strategic picture, particularly China's historical dependence on the Malacca Strait. For decades, the overwhelming majority of China's oil and natural gas imports have originated from the Middle East and Africa. These energy supplies traverse thousands of nautical miles before reaching Chinese ports, and nearly all of them pass through one critical choke point: the Strait of Malacca, a narrow waterway between Malaysia and Indonesia. This creates an obvious strategic vulnerability. The strait is only about 2.8 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. A naval blockade could effectively cut off approximately 80% of China's seaborne energy imports almost overnight. This isn't theoretical. Both India and the United States have made statements, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, suggesting they would consider blockading sea routes in the event of certain conflicts, particularly scenarios involving Taiwan. The United States Navy regularly conducts exercises in the Indian Ocean and South China Sea with allies like India, Australia, and Japan. While officially described as freedom of navigation operations, these exercises also serve to demonstrate the capability to control maritime choke points if necessary. Chinese strategic planners are acutely aware of this vulnerability. Any nation that depends on seaborne imports for critical resources while facing potential adversaries with dominant naval power must worry about blockades. This is why pipeline connections to Russia hold such strategic value for China. They're not subject to naval interdiction. Natural gas flowing through land-based pipelines from Siberia cannot be blocked by aircraft carriers or submarines. If China can source substantial portions of its energy needs through land routes, it significantly reduces its vulnerability to maritime blockades. Power of Siberia 2, delivering 50 billion cubic meters annually, would represent a major step toward reducing this strategic exposure. But only if the pipeline itself is secure and doesn't introduce new vulnerabilities. Understanding these concerns, China proposed an alternative route earlier this year. Rather than crossing through Mongolia, Beijing suggested rerouting the pipeline through Kazakhstan instead. After several months of consultations and negotiations, this alternative route has gained serious traction. In recent statements, Kazakhstan's ambassador to Russia confirmed that planning is underway for a new natural gas pipeline that would pass through Kazakh territory before entering China. While specific details regarding construction timelines and final pricing remain under discussion, diplomatic sources indicate that route maps have already been officially signed, a significant step forward in the planning process. From a purely logistical perspective, the Kazakhstan route offers several advantages. The distance would be somewhat shorter, potentially reducing construction costs. Kazakhstan and China already maintain extensive trade relationships and share considerable border infrastructure, which could simplify coordination. Moreover, Kazakhstan has historically maintained closer diplomatic alignment with both Russia and China compared to Mongolia's increasingly independent foreign policy stance. The political calculation also favors Kazakhstan. While no nation is entirely predictable in its foreign policy orientation, Kazakhstan has demonstrated less inclination to position itself as a third neighbor seeking to balance against Russia and China through Western partnerships. For Chinese planners, this likely translates to greater confidence in long-term supply security. However, changing the route isn't without complications. New environmental assessments must be conducted, different local authorities need to grant permissions, and the engineering specifications might require modifications. These factors explain why, even with agreement in principle, the project still hasn't broken ground as originally scheduled. It's essential to recognize that Power of Siberia 2 represents far more than a simple commercial transaction between energy supplier and customer. This pipeline is deeply embedded in the broader strategic relationship between China and Russia, a partnership that has strengthened considerably in recent years. Both nations face complex relationships with Western powers, particularly the United States and European Union. Both have experienced economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure. Both seek to establish alternative international frameworks that reduce Western dominance in global affairs. Energy cooperation forms a crucial pillar of this strategic alignment. For Russia, particularly following recent geopolitical developments that have severely strained relations with Europe, the Chinese market represents not just an opportunity, but potentially a necessity. Russian gas that previously flowed westward now needs alternative destinations. China's enormous and growing market offers a lifeline that can partially offset reduced European demand. For China, Russian energy supplies provide not only physical security through land-based transport, but also diplomatic leverage. A China less dependent on Middle Eastern oil and natural gas potentially has greater freedom of action in its foreign policy. The relationship with Russia provides options and reduces vulnerability. Western media outlets have occasionally attempted to portray tensions in negotiations as evidence of fundamental cracks in the Sino-Russian partnership. While it's true that China and Russia don't agree on everything, no two major powers ever do, the strategic logic binding them together remains powerful. Both nations benefit enormously from their cooperation, and both understand that Western powers would prefer to see their partnership dissolve. The eventual resolution of the Power of Siberia. Two negotiations will have implications extending far beyond China, Russia, and Central Asia. Global energy markets are increasingly being reshaped by geopolitical considerations as much as by simple supply and demand. If the pipeline proceeds through Kazakhstan as now seems likely, it will represent a significant milestone in the development of overland energy infrastructure across Eurasia. Other nations in the region may see opportunities for similar arrangements, potentially leading to a more interconnected continental energy grid. European nations, meanwhile, are watching these developments with mixed feelings. Having reduced their dependence on Russian gas following recent conflicts, many European governments are now grappling with higher energy costs and supply uncertainties. The sight of Russia redirecting its energy exports to China serves as a reminder that energy remains fungible. Gas not sold to Europe can find other buyers. For the United States, which has become a major liquefied natural gas exporter, the prospect of China sourcing more of its imports from Russia via pipeline represents a challenge. American LNG exports to China have been substantial in recent years, but pipeline gas typically undercuts LNG on price when volumes are sufficient. If Power of Siberia 2 comes online as planned, it could reduce China's need for American energy imports, removing one potential area of economic interdependence between Washington and Beijing. So where does this leave us regarding actual construction? The honest answer is that significant uncertainty remains. While the Kazakhstan route appears to be gaining favor and preliminary agreements have been signed, translating route maps into actual pipeline construction requires substantial additional work. Financing must be finalized, with clarity on exactly how the $13 billion investment will be distributed among parties. Environmental impact assessments need completion and approval. Land rights must be secured along the entire route. Engineering firms need to be contracted and equipment ordered. Regulatory approvals from multiple governments must be obtained. Even under optimistic scenarios, these processes take time. The original 2024 construction start date has clearly passed. A revised timeline might aim for groundbreaking in 2025 or 2026, with completion potentially pushed back to 2030 or beyond. Some analysts have speculated that price negotiations remain a genuine sticking point, with Russia seeking higher rates than China is willing to pay. This wouldn't be unusual. Energy contracts are notoriously complex, especially when they involve decades-long commitments and market conditions that fluctuate significantly over time. Others point to the technical complexities of building pipeline infrastructure across challenging terrain through multiple jurisdictions in a region that experiences extreme temperature variations. These aren't insurmountable obstacles, but they require careful planning and substantial expertise. It's worth considering this situation from Mongolia's viewpoint as well. The potential loss of Power of Siberia. Two transit revenues represents a significant economic setback for a nation that has relatively few major sources of foreign exchange. $30 million annually might seem modest by Chinese or Russian standards, but for Mongolia's economy, which has a GDP of approximately $15 billion, it represents meaningful income. Beyond direct transit fees, the pipeline could have stimulated broader economic development, construction jobs, maintenance contracts, and indirect benefits from increased regional connectivity. Mongolian officials have likely been watching the negotiations with concern, realizing that their country's increasingly independent foreign policy may have unintended economic consequences. This presents a classic dilemma for smaller nations situated between great powers. Asserting independence and pursuing diverse partnerships offers political benefits, but may come with economic costs.